Can we trust the New Testament? Part 1. The Manuscript and Eyewitness Evidence. Imagine you are on trial, your life is on the line, and the only evidence that can save you is a document. But the prosecutor stands up and says, "We cannot trust that document. It is too old, it was copied by hand for centuries. The original is long gone." Now ask yourself this: what if that document had nearly 25,000 surviving copies? What if scholars could compare those copies from different places, different languages, and different centuries? What if some of the evidence was made within decades of the original? Would you throw that evidence out? That is exactly the situation with the New Testament. Welcome. My name is Alan. This video is based on Josh McDowell's landmark work, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Today we are asking one of the most important questions any thoughtful believer or skeptic can ask. Can we actually trust the New Testament as a historical document? Not as a slogan, not as a feeling, as history. Before we go further, we need to be precise. In this video, the question is not, is the New Testament divinely inspired? That is a theological question, and Christians do believe Scripture is God-breathed. But today we are asking a narrower historical question. Does the New Testament reliably transmit the events it claims to record? In other words, if we apply the normal tests historians use for any ancient document, what happens? Scholar C. Sanders describes 3 standard tests for ancient documents. First, the bibliographic test. How many manuscripts do we have, and how close are they to the originals? Second, the internal evidence test. Does the document present credible testimony, eyewitness memory, and internal consistency? Third, the external evidence test. Does outside history confirm or contradict what the document says? In Part 1, we will focus on the first 2 tests. In Part 2, we will turn to non-Christian sources and archaeology. Test 1, the bibliographic test. Here's the basic reality. We do not have the original handwritten documents for any ancient text. Not Homer, not Caesar, not Plato, not Aristotle. What historians normally have are copies of copies. So the question becomes, how many copies survived and how much time passed between the original and the earliest surviving copies? The more manuscript copies we have, the more scholars can compare them and identify copying differences. The closer those copies are to the original, the less time there was for legendary development or corruption to take hold. That is the normal historical standard. And when we apply that standard to the New Testament, the numbers are staggering. The New Testament has over 5,600 Greek manuscripts. Add more than 10,000 Latin Vulgate manuscripts. Add more than 9,000 early manuscripts in other languages, including Syriac, Coptic, Armenian, Ethiopic, and others. The total is nearly 25,000 surviving manuscript witnesses. Let that number land for a moment. Nearly 25,000. Now compare that with other ancient works that nobody seriously throws out. Homer's Iliad comes in second among ancient literary works with about 643 manuscripts. Caesar's Gallic Wars has around 10, Thucydides has 8, Plato has 7. We accept these texts as historically important, yet the New Testament manuscript tradition is not merely a little stronger. It is in another category, and manuscript count is only one part of the issue. The other part is time gap. For many classical authors, the earliest substantial copies come hundreds or even more than 1,000 years after the original. For Thucydides and Plato, the gap is often around 1,300 years. For Caesar, around 1,000 years. For the New Testament, some manuscript evidence appears within decades, and major codices appear within a few centuries. Sir Frederick Kenyon, former director of the British Museum and one of the great manuscript authorities of the 20th century, put it this way: "The last foundation for any doubt that the Scriptures have come down to us substantially as they were written has now been removed." That is not a preacher making an emotional claim. That is a world-class manuscript scholar speaking about textual evidence. Now, a fair objection comes next. If these documents were copied by hand, did copying errors creep in? Yes, of course they did. Ancient scribes made spelling differences, word order differences, accidental omissions, and marginal notes. But here is the key point. Because we have so many manuscripts, the differences are visible. They can be compared, and the overwhelming majority are minor. Dockery, Matthews, and Sloan make the important point that not one fundamental doctrine of the Christian faith rests upon a disputed text, not the resurrection, not the deity of Christ, not salvation by grace, not the central claims of the gospel. F.J.A. Hort said that in variety and fullness of evidence, the New Testament text is unique and unequaled among ancient prose writings. And there is another layer of evidence that many people have never considered: the early church fathers. Christian leaders in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries quoted the New Testament constantly in sermons, letters, commentaries, and theological works. These writings were preserved independently from the manuscript tradition itself. That gives historians a second way to check what the New Testament text looked like. Consider the scale. Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Tertullian, Eusebius, and many others quote the New Testament thousands upon thousands of times. In the data McDowell cites, these writers alone provide over 36,000 New Testament quotations. Origen by himself accounts for nearly 18,000. That is not a fragile chain. That is a web of independent witnesses. Sir David Dalrymple once asked a remarkable question. If every New Testament manuscript were destroyed, could the New Testament be reconstructed from the writings of the early church fathers alone? After searching through the surviving Christian writings of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, his answer was stunning. He found the entire New Testament, except for 11 verses. Think about that. Even if the manuscript tradition vanished, the text had been quoted so widely that nearly the whole New Testament could be recovered. So the bibliographic test gives us 3 lines of strength. First, an extraordinary number of manuscripts. Second, unusually early manuscript evidence. Third, independent confirmation through early Christian quotations. If we're going to reject the New Testament on textual grounds, we would have to become far more skeptical of almost every other ancient text as well. Now we move to test 2, internal evidence. The question here is not simply, do we have many copies? The question is, what kind of testimony do those documents contain? Do the authors write like people inventing private myths centuries later? Or do they write as eyewitnesses and investigators close to the events? Luke opens his gospel by saying that he investigated things carefully and drew from those who were eyewitnesses from the beginning. Peter says, we did not follow cleverly devised myths, but were eyewitnesses of his majesty. John says, we proclaim to you what we have seen and heard. And in Acts, Peter preaches in Jerusalem and says, Jesus of Nazareth was attested to you, as you yourselves know. That phrase matters. He is not saying, trust us because nobody can check. He is saying, you know this happened. This is one of the most powerful features of the earliest Christian preaching. The apostles proclaimed the resurrection in Jerusalem, the very city where Jesus had been crucified, within weeks of the event, in front of people who knew the story firsthand. If the claims were fabricated, hostile witnesses had every motive and every opportunity to expose them. They could have produced the body. They could have crushed the movement at the beginning, but they did not. F. Bruce put the logic sharply. The earliest preachers could not risk reporting inaccuracies because hostile listeners were present, informed, and eager to correct them. That does not prove every theological conclusion by itself. But historically, it means the New Testament message did not grow in a sealed room far away from scrutiny. It entered public life in the very place where the events were said to have happened. Dating matters here. Paul's letters are commonly dated between about AD 50 and 66. Mark is often dated around AD 50 to 60. Luke around AD 58 to 65. Matthew is often placed around AD 70 to 80, with some arguing earlier. John is usually dated between AD 80 and 100. Even on these common dates, the New Testament documents were written within the eyewitness generation. And here is a fascinating detail. John A.T. Robinson, a liberal scholar and no conservative evangelical apologist, shocked many readers by arguing and redating the New Testament that all 27 New Testament books were written before AD 70. William F. Albright likewise argued there was no solid basis for dating any New Testament book after about AD 80. The point is not that every scholar agrees on every date. The point is that the documents belong to the living memory of the first century. So let us bring part 1 together. Bibliographically, the New Testament is the best attested document of the ancient world. Nearly 25,000 manuscript witnesses, early fragments, major codices within centuries, and massive quotation evidence from the Church Fathers. Internally, the authors write as eyewitnesses or careful investigators. Their claims were made publicly, early, and in the presence of people who could challenge them. But we are not done. In part 2, we will ask what non-Christian sources say about Jesus: Roman historians, Jewish sources, pagan critics, and archaeological discoveries that keep confirming New Testament details. We will look at Pontius Pilate, the Pool of Bethesda, Sir William Ramsay, and the external evidence that surrounds the New Testament like a historical fingerprint. The Apostle Paul told Festus that the Christian message was true and reasonable because these things were not done in a corner. That is the heart of the Christian claim. The events of the New Testament happened in history. They were witnessed, they were recorded, and the evidence demands a verdict. I will see you in part 2.